that light. All that we know and all that we could have known, we're going to have to give an account for. Alright, we began looking at the generation concept, and we spent the last study looking at the number 4 as being a number of judgment, four generations. Exodus 20. Let us read the second commandment, Exodus 20. We as Adventists know 8 to 11 by heart. Sometimes you forget the other 9 commandments. And we're going to read from verses 2 to verses 6. Exodus 20, verses 2 to 6. This is the second commandment. We begin. Thou shalt not. We're going to read it together. Exodus 20, verses 4 to 6. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. And this is the second commandment. And here the Lord outlined that within the framework of the freedom of choice and the multiplication of humanity, in any particular generation, denomination, or nation, by the 4th generation, an iniquity that is sowed in the first will come to maturity by the 4th generation and be visited with judgment as a consequence if it is not repented of. And we spent the last study looking at that number 4. God mentioned it to Abraham that his seed would be strangers in the land of Egypt, and after the 4th generation he would visit them because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. God cannot arbitrarily do things, and so he has to allow sin to ripen to the point where he can withdraw and allow judgments to fall to break the power of any particular nation that is holding his people. And when you look at Israel and Egypt, God had to wait until iniquity ripened before he could visit them with judgment and deliver Israel. When it came to Babylon, he had to wait till Babylon collapsed. And iniquity ripened under Belshazzar when he brought the vessels from the house of the Lord and drank therein at his party and gave, we are told that he praised the gods of gold, silver, wood, and stone, and did not remember Jehovah. And so the Lord gave him over to those gods to preserve his empire, and they couldn't do anything. And so Cyrus came in and cut off his head on that night. And Daniel warned him, you know the history of your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, how that he exalted himself, and the Lord withdrew from him, and he lost his reason, and ate grass for 7 years like an ox. And although you know all that, you still perpetuated that transgression by bringing out the vessels of the house of the Lord and drinking in them. The hand came forth and wrote, you are weighed in the balances and found wanting. Judgment was executed. He lost his head and lost his empire on that night. And we have the 4 first kings in Israel, and by the end, well, not even, by the beginning of the reign of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, the empire was split into never to be united again until Babylonian captivity. And we saw that there were four world empires: Babylon, Media-Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, and there would only be 4 according to the prophecy, and then that was collapsed and divided into the 10 divisions, and there will never be another world ruling empire between then and the second coming of Christ, because according to the prophecy, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven would set up a kingdom that would not come to an end. We also went to Revelation 6 and we saw the color code, the 4 horses representing the first 4 churches in Christendom: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, and Thyatira. And by the time you get to Thyatira, the 4th church, the church was dead, spiritually dead, and of no use to the Lord concerning finishing the controversy. He had to start over again. And it started with the Reformation, came out to the Protestant churches, and then you had Adventism, you have Philadelphia, which is the true Adventism, and then that fell away, and then you have Apostate Adventism from 1859 all the way up to now, because the message that was given to deliver it was rejected, and the apostasy has continued and has deepened, and that too will end up in Babylonian captivity like Israel, and the nation that what it has become like will come and conquer it. They will know. When we get down to that, we will go into more detail. So today we're going to begin and look at the 4 generations. Now, Adventists are people of the law. They believe the law. 4th commandment, preach that is to be kept. Our focus is largely the 4th commandment. We missed the other 9. Now, if you keep the Sabbath truly, you're keeping all 10 commandments without having to worry about it. Alright? But the Adventists can keep the 4th commandment externally, but without the spirit of the rest of the Lord in them. If you can keep the 4th commandment sincerely and truly, and rest in God, you're keeping all 10 without even knowing. The Sabbath is the most moral of the commandments. Alright? If you can rest in God fully, you're keeping all 10 commandments without even trying. But they have the legal code, but the spirit is lacking. Alright, we're going to look at the number 4 within generations, and we're going to build up to it, apply it specifically to the Adventist world of which we are part. And the book of Joel is going to have a secondary application to Adventism, but we're going to go to Joel now. Joel is the second of the minor prophets: Daniel, Hosea, Joel. Chapter 1. We're going to read the whole chapter, verses 1 to 20 responsively. We're going to see in on the first 7 verses, but we're going to read the whole chapter. Joel 1 to 20 responsively. I begin. The word of the Lord that came to Joel the son of Pethuel.
This is you, and give ear all the inhabitants of the land.
At this day in your days,
or in the days of your fathers.
Tell ye your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children another generation.
That which the palmer hath left hath the locust eaten, and that which the locust hath left hath the cankerworm eaten, and that which the cankerworm hath left hath the caterpillar eaten.
Awake, ye drunkards, and weep, and howl, all ye drinkers of wine, because of your new wine, for it is cut off from your mouth.
For a nation is come up upon my land, strong and developed, those teeth are the teeth of the lion, and he hath the 3 teeth of a great lion.
He hath laid my vine waste, and barked my fig tree. He hath made it clean bare, and cast it away. The branches thereof are made white.
The man like a virgin, girded with sackcloth, for the husband of her youth.
The meat offering and the drink offering is cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests, the Lord's ministers, mourn.
The field is wasted, the land mourneth, for the corn is wasted, the new wine is dried up, and the oil languisheth.
Be ye ashamed, O ye husbandmen, howl, O ye vine dressers, for the wheat and for the barley, because the harvest of the field is perished.
The vine is dried up, and the fig tree languisheth. The pomegranate tree, and the palm tree also, and the apple tree, even all the trees of the field are withered, because joy is withered away from sons of men.
Gird yourselves and lament, ye priests, howl, ye ministers of the altar. Come, lie all night in sackcloth, ye ministers of my God, for the meat offering and the drink offering is withholden from the house of your God.
Sanctify your fast, call the solemn assembly, gather gatherers and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God, and cry unto the Lord.
Alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand, and as a destruction from the Almighty shall it come.
and
Is
is
not the meat cut off before your eyes? Yet joy and gladness from the house of our God.
The seed is rotten under their clods, the garners are laid desolate, the barns are broken down, for the corn is withered.
How the beast groan, the birds of cattle are perplexed, the because they have no pasture, yea, the flocks of sheep are made desolate.
O Lord, to thee will I cry, for the fire have devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and the flame have burned all the trees of the field. The beasts of the field cry also unto thee, for the rivers of waters are dried up, and the fire have devoured the pastures of the wilderness. Now, most of the prophets would identify Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel. Those identified what years and under what kings they were prophesying, and so you'll be able to tell exactly when they were ministering. Isaiah tells you what kings he prophesied under. Jeremiah told you what that. Ezekiel told you where he was. Most of them, some of the minor prophets, don't identify. But the Lord gives us enough evidence in His Word that we should be able to pinpoint the time frame of their ministry. Now, what we're looking at now is the number 4 and the judgments that fell upon Jerusalem, and we're going to parallel this to Adventism. Verse 1 to 4. The word of the Lord that came to Joel the son of Pethuel, hear this, ye old men, and give ear all ye inhabitants of the land. Have this been in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Tell ye your children of it. That's 2 generations there. Tell ye your children. So ye are the first, your children are the second, and let your children tell their children, which is the 3rd, and their children another generation, which is the 4th generation. Verse 4. That which the palmer worm hath left, hath the locust eaten. That which the locusts have left, hath the cankerworm eaten. And that which the cankerworm have left, hath the caterpillar eaten. 4. Now, the iniquity of the fathers will build upon the children until the 3rd and 4th generation. So the fathers sow iniquity. If it is not repented of by the 2nd generation, is going to be visited by the 3rd and the 4th. So here you have them identified: ye, your children, their children, and another generation. And you have mentioned here 4 of the worst scourges that could afflict any harvest in any land, for that matter, not alone Israel. But since it's written in the context of Israel, you have the palmer worm, you have the locust, you have the cankerworm, and then you have the caterpillar. And one of the worst scourges to happen in the Middle East is locusts. When they come in numbers, they can darken the sky for sheer numbers. And by the time they're gone, everything green except maybe a green skirt or green blouse is eaten. They come in numbers and they can decimate a harvest, a crop, and leave death and starvation in their wake. And this is one of the plagues that hit Egypt in those times. And the methods for them multiplying are relatively simple sometimes. Let's say a particular disease can wipe out one of their natural enemies, and it doesn't keep them in check. And circumstances being right, rain, abundance of rain, and they can multiply to millions in a short period of time. And most of these insects have a very short lifespan, so you can get a vast amount of them in a short period of time. But for any farmer, this is a horror story. By the time they're finished, you have nothing left for the market or for eating or whatever the case may be. And it can reduce any economy to shambles, leading to starvation, which normally is followed by violence and crime, because when people get hungry, they need to eat. The Spirit of God not restraining them, things going to get worse. So you have here these 4, which are judgments. And now, verse 5, awake, ye drunkards, and weep and howl, all ye drinkers of wine, because of the new wine, for it is cut off from your mouth. Listen now, for a nation is come up upon my land, strong and without number, whose teeth are the teeth of a what?
Lion.
And ye have the teeth of a what?
Lion.
What nation empire comes to mind? When it comes to lion, who comes to mind? Babylon, don't be afraid. Alright, in Daniel chapter 7, the lion is used to represent Babylon. The great lion with 2 wings. Daniel saw him, and the wings Now, it's not normal for a lion to have wings, you know. Lions don't have wings. They're quadrupeds that run on the ground. But the Spirit of God add, what?
Thank God.
Thank God. Stephen says, thank God. We ain't got to worry much because lions are not indigenous to America except mountain lions, some of the more eastern states. But 2 wings were placed on him to show the speed with which he would conquer the world. And Nebuchadnezzar came to the top of the world in a short period of time. Conquered the world. He went forth literally conquering and to conquer, and he conquered the world at a relatively young age. Perhaps by 40s, 50s, Nebuchadnezzar was on top of the world with Babylon. And the last for him to conquer was what? Israel. When he conquered Israel, his triumph was complete. If Israel was in harmony with God, Nebuchadnezzar would have had not the slightest chance to conquer Israel. Remember, Sennacherib come up with a massive army, and the Lord told the king, don't worry about them. He can go back to his land. You don't have to live a hand. He can go back to his land, shame of face, and those that come out of his loins going to kill him. If they were under God's control, Nebuchadnezzar could not have conquered Israel. Don't care how powerful or strong Babylon is. When God's people are on his direction, no amount of armies or nations can capture them. But Israel was, according to verse 4 and 5, it was going to reap the judgment of the iniquity that was sown in the first generation and continued on without being repented of. So this is telling you then that the conquering of this is around the time when Babylon came. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 8. From verses 5 to 8. Isaiah 8. The Lord spake also unto me again, saying, For as much as this people refuseth the waters of Shiloh that go softly, and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria, and all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels, and go over all his banks. And he shall pass through Judah, he shall overflow and go over, he shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. Now, according to Daniel, Revelation 17:15, what does water represent? Multitudes, nations, tongues, and people. So, according to Isaiah 8, verse 7, now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of who? And what's another name for the Syria? So here the Lord is prophesying that Babylon is going to come upon it, and use the term, note the term here, waters, and all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks. He's going to overflow everybody. Alright? So the biblical interpretive principle in Revelation 17:15 is scriptural from quote unquote the Old Testament. The Lord is, by large, we human beings are, we're mostly water. We're between 75 and 80% water. You know that? We're about 80% water as a species. So when the Lord uses water to represent us, he's on track. Alright? He's speaking what he knows, as a matter of fact, what he did. So here, speaking of them, he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks. There was no limit. There was no stopping Babylon. There was no stopping Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 8, and he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck. And the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. And remember that when Babylon was shown in the dream of Daniel, the lion had on how many wings? 2 wings. Alright? And in his coming, Nebuchadnezzar would conquer and go over all the channels, all the banks. There would be no stopping. He would overflow every single thing. And by the time he got to Jerusalem, his triumph was complete. And they had been brought under his dominion. The first carrying away, he took Daniel, his 3 buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah, if you want to use the Hebrew names, and he took Ezekiel. He was among the captives by the river Chebar. They were taken in the first carrying away, and left the king. His name was Hezekiah, and he changed it to Zedekiah. He gave him a Babylonian name, Zedekiah, and put him in charge. Now he would still have the dignity to be king, but he was ruling under Nebuchadnezzar's directive. So really and truly, when you give over to another power, really and truly you ain't got no more power. You're just a figurehead. But you allowed him to remain there in position, but he was going to rule according to Nebuchadnezzar and under his directives, but he was given the dignity to remain. And he got proud and behaved badly, and Nebuchadnezzar came back the second time, and the Lord warned him through Jeremiah: surrender and go out peacefully and preserve your life. His advisors said to him, a false prophet named Hananiah come and say, Lord has shown me that in 2 years' time he's going to break this yoke off of the necks. And the Lord said to Jeremiah, tell him, you break this wooden yoke and you're making for them a yoke of iron. And the guys had the United Nations then. A lot of them come together and decide to form a coalition and fight against Nebuchadnezzar. And the Lord sent Jeremiah to them, to their United Nations back then, and said, listen, I have given them all into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Don't even form the coalition. Don't try, because you're not going to succeed. And a false prophet come and said, oh my Jeremiah, the Lord tell me you can break this yoke in 2 years. The Lord said you can break that wooden yoke and you can put a yoke on them iron. They can go to Babylon for 70 years. They didn't want to hear that. And he died that year. And he didn't listen. So when Nebuchadnezzar came back and besieged Jerusalem for a year and a half, this is, you can find these in a lot of parts of 1 Kings 24 to the end, and Jeremiah. He besieged it for a whole year and a half until all, because back then you had your city, you had it walled around, and you have inside, if you manage your resources well, you can last for years. But when pressure is going on outside, people start being reasonable and rational, and people start getting greedy, and things that can last a long time get burned up and consumed quickly. So when the food started to run out, Jeremiah asked the king, where are all the advisors and counsels that tell you that Nebuchadnezzar can come to take the city? Where are they now? And then he left, tried to run, and he was pursued, caught, brought him to Nebuchadnezzar. They killed his children in front of his eyes and put out his 2 eyes and led him into captive into Babylon, blind, when he could have gone with both his eyes. But he didn't listen to Jeremiah, listened to the false prophets that told him what he wanted to hear, and rejected the word of the Lord and suffered the dire consequences of disobedience to the word of the Lord. So by the second time they came back then, Israel was taken and burned. So when you read in Joel 1, the priests crying and mourning, everybody that was rich, all the houses were burnt down and mashed up. The temple of the Lord was burned down and stripped of all its riches. You imagine that? This is the temple that Solomon dedicated, and the Lord's glory filled it for 2 weeks, and they couldn't go in the ministry. The Lord set a seal to it, and it reached the stage now where Nebuchadnezzar could come and burn down the house and take away all the vessels and carry everything into Babylonian captivity. How it goes to show that the people of God would have had to fall so far and gone so far from God that he can allow a Babylonian to come and mash up his house. Nebuchadnezzar came and burned down the house of the Lord and took away everything. And we are told that he left the poor sort of the people, so it was good to be poor then. Right? Only the poor people were left in the land. Let them to take, carry on everything else that was worthwhile. Every situation had its advantages. Time and place. Alright, so back here the Lord is showing that when Assyria come, strong and many, he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks, overflow everything, conquer everything. This is Nebuchadnezzar. So back to Joel now. So when we see verses 6 and 7, speaking of a nation strong without number, whose teeth are the teeth of a lion and have the teeth of a great lion, he hath laid my vine waste and barked my fig tree. He hath made it clean bare and cast it away. The branches thereof are made white. So Joel is prophesying concerning the time of Nebuchadnezzar coming to destroy Jerusalem. Now, turn with me to Matthew 1. Matthew 1, verses 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David are how many? 14 generations. And from David until the carrying away into Babylon are how many? 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are how many? 14 generations. Now, verse 6. You want to count all 42 or you want to count the 14 between David and Babylonian captivity? Huh? Verse 6. And Jesse begat David, the king. Alright, so David begat Solomon. Verse 7. Solomon begat Rehoboam. Now count with me, alright? You're going to start again. You're going to count with me. David is 1. He begat Solomon, that's 2. Solomon, verse 7. Solomon begat Rehoboam, that's 3. Rehoboam begat Abiah, 4. Abiah begat Asa, verse 8. And Asa begat Jehoshaphat. Y'all counting? That's 6. And Jehoshaphat begat Joram. And Joram begat Ozias, verse 9. And Ozias begat Jotham. And Jotham begat Achaz. And Achaz begat Ezekiel. And Ezekiel begat Manasseh. And Manasseh begat Ammon. And Ammon begat Josiah. And Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brethren about the time of their carried away to Babylon. How many was that? No, it can't be 50. No, y'all count somebody twice. You gotta be 14. Alright, we go over again now. It's between David and the Babylonian captivity. How many generations supposed to be a part of verse 70? 14. We go over again. Alright, let me start back. We got verse 1. We got at verse 1. The book of generations of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, so that's 2. Abraham is 1, Isaac is 2. Okay? I can only call the son because when I call the one previous, I think you all get it mixed up. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judas. How many that? 4. Phares, 5. Ezra, 6. Aram, 7. Aminadab, 8. Nason, 9. Salmon, 10. Boaz, 11. Obed, 12. Jesse, 13. David, how many? 14. Alright? So you have to get from Abraham to David is 14. So from David now to the Babylonian captivity is going to be how many? 14. So let me go again. Pardon? I didn't hear it. I didn't hear it. No. You can't start from the son, then you got to start from the father. With the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, so you got to include the father. Before Edgar Senior, the cabinet, Edgar Junior. Good. Alright, so where are we going now from? David, Solomon, 2. Rehoboam, Abiah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Ozias, Jotham, Achaz, Ezekiel, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, Jeconiah. Alright, no. Josiah and Jeconiah and his brethren about the time of the carrying away to Babylon. Of the carrying away into Babylon. Now, you're mentioning you're mentioning the son that would carry on the messianic line. All right, so the brethren are not to be included because you're only dealing with the messianic line. So that
So where you stop?
Jacob had, how many sons Jacob had?
12.
But you only mention Judas because this is the messianic line. Christ came through Judah. But Jacob had 12 sons. You mentioned the other 11. We're dealing with the messianic line. This is the line of Christ from Abraham all the way down to Christ. So we're only counting the one who would propagate the Messiah.
Okay.
All right?
No, something just hit me. No, the phrase Judas is used obviously to refer to Judah.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, Judas, I believe, Iscariot.
No.
No, I'm talking about Judas Iscariot. No, not this is Judah. But Judas Iscariot, would he have been of the line of Judah?
Of the line of Judah?
Yeah.
I would not say so, no.
I'm just checking because I remember Sister White says that the disciples felt that he was someone that would be good among their numbers. I'm just wondering if they were basing it partly
Maybe because of his name.
on the lineal. I know the major thing was the fact that he was smart and had a lot of ability.
And commanding appearance, etc., executive ability, etc. But apparently in the Old Testament, Judah, in the New Testament, it's spent Judas. We have distinguished between that Judas and the Judas, the disciple who betrayed the Lord. Alright? So, now from Josiah, from Babylon, from verse 12 now. And after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begat Shealtiel. Shealtiel begat Zerubbabel. Same Matthew 1, verse 13. Are y'all counting? We start back in Alright, verse 12. And they were brought to Babylon. Jeconiah begat Shealtiel. And Shealtiel begat Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel begat Abiud. Abiud begat Eliakim. Eliakim begat Azor. Azor begat Sadok. Sadok begat Akim. Akim begat Eliud. Eliud begat Eliezer. Eliezer begat Mathan. Mathan begat Jacob. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom it was born Jesus, who was called Christ. So Christ would make how many? 14. Now, he was no relation to Joseph, but my Bible says Joseph was the son-in-law of who was Mary's father. Alright, so Joseph had no relation to Mary whatsoever. So we are tracing the genealogy of Jesus, and he's mentioned because in the Jewish culture, women, unless they were prominent and significant, were not given much attention. So you would trace the genealogy through the father. But since Joseph was no relation to Mary, he's the son-in-law of Mary's father because he's going to marry Mary. So she's the one who really is to be here. But in the Jewish culture, put the women aside unless they were significant. So Joseph had no connection whatsoever with Christ in terms of genealogy. So really and truly it should be Mary's father. Joseph was her fiancé to be enjoyed, and he would be his father-in-law, not his father, because Joseph had no lineage or connection with Jesus whatsoever. Jesus' only parent was who? Mary. He got his humanity from Mary, and it would have come through the father, through the daughter. But in that culture, they did not mention women. They're not going to trace the genealogy through a woman. They're going to chase it through the man. But Joseph had no connection with Jesus as far as bloodline and lineage is concerned. So we get down here then to the 42. Sister Roberts.
What I was saying was, but anyway, so when I look at this, you as you said that women was not, this come down all through the ages. Men in the Caribbean treat women like, if they come home and the food is not ready, they beat you. And so this thing was from way back, that women was treated like nothing. And
the gospel is to liberate the word. And sadly, people who have the gospel interpret the gospel with that same bias, because it's the Jews who took. God said to Eve, your desire can be unto your husband and he can rule over you. And the rulership was not a dictatorship now. But the Jews took that and interpret that text and made women to be less than second-class citizens in Jerusalem. So that, I would have mentioned to you before, the guy that had the 7 daughters, and the wicked leadership in the church wanted to take away their inheritance. And they behaved bad. No, that's not going to happen. Our father had no son. He was not among those rebels that died when they rebelled against Moses. And we are entitled to our inheritance, and we're not giving it up. And the fellows were insisting on it, and they brought it to Moses. Moses said, all right, I'm going to come back to you. The beauty of Moses as a leader, he let the Lord settle everything. Moses let the Lord say, listen, if you have a situation, the Lord said that they are right, give them the inheritance. And that should have set a precedent and changed the history. But minds don't change that easily, especially when you have an agenda or axe to grind, and you will find a Bible verse and a text to support your position. You will find a Bible text and a verse to support any position you want, as long as you want to believe it and you like it. And the Lord would have delivered them from all of that if they were willing to accept the word of God to set the table and the playing field level. But it was years of that. Now turn to Luke. Luke chapter 3. Let me just strengthen the point that I told you about Joseph being the son-in-law to Eli. Luke 3. Verse 23. This is the genealogy of Jesus. And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. My margin has son-in-law, because Joseph had no connection with Heli. Joseph had Jesus had one earthly parent, and that was Mary. He got his humanity from Mary. So any genealogy of Jesus at the human level must come from Mary and go right back up, because he had no earthly father. Alright, he had no earthly father. So his humanity and his genealogy must be reckoned through Mary. In Matthew 1, Matthew start from Abraham. In Luke 3, Luke start from Jesus and went all the way back up to Adam, verse 38, which was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam, which was the son of God. And in here in Luke, the genealogy starts from Adam and comes down to Jesus, or it goes from Jesus backwards up to Adam. And when you look at it this way, you are seeing the second Adam. Christ is the second Adam. The first Adam sinned and mashed up the human race. God had to find a new reproductive line, because the one that Adam was given was now written off and was producing what? Only simple human beings, subjects for Satan's kingdom. So God made us in righteousness, gave us the power to reproduce, and we were to multiply and subject for his kingdom. Lo and behold, he sold out to Adam, and the reproductive line now is, instead of making subjects for God's kingdom, is making subjects for whose kingdom? Satan. The whole world is full of sinners, all born sinners. So God had to start over again, and that is where Christ now is the second Adam, and he's going to produce a family for his father, born of the Spirit, a new reproductive line. So when you get to Christ, your choice is yours: stay in the first Adam and be a subject of Satan, master the world, or get into Christ, the second Adam, and be a subject of God's new kingdom, which is the new spiritual line. The first Adam was made what? A living soul. The second Adam was made what? Quickening spirit. 1 Corinthians 15, 45 to 49, Paul is very clear. He outlines the two Adams and the two reproductive lines. One is flesh and blood. The other one is spirit. So if you go back to Luke, Luke takes you from Christ all the way back up to Adam. And we can go back then to, now if you, when you go here then from Matthew, verse 17, you have the 42 generations between Abraham and Christ. 7 times 6, 7 is the number of completeness, 6 is the number of man. Christ had become completely man. He had to wait until the race was at its lowest in order to lift it up, because if there was anybody above which Christ was born, that person can find that as an excuse for not being saved, because he said, look, you didn't come to me, you didn't come down to my level. So the Lord had to wait until the race was down at its lowest point to meet us, so that nobody would have an excuse for not living sinless. He gave his son to the world at its lowest point, and when he could answer Satan's arguments in sinful fallen flesh in a very bad neighborhood called Nazareth, where Nathanael said nothing good can come out of. And God answered him, and answered the whole of Israel, and answered the whole universe resoundingly by producing perfect sinless character in his son in a very bad neighborhood and in bad flesh, so that we don't have any excuse. People like to say they want to go to the city because you can't perfect character in the city. But if you can't perfect sin in character with God, there's a flaw in God's government. Country living is good and has its place, but that ain't nothing to do with character building. The best place to build character is where? Where the worst behavior is. The worst drivers you find in New York. If you're a driver, the Lord can thank you for your trip. We were going to camp in Florida a year at 7. Going to camp and I'm driving. We come up to the traffic light, 6 or 7 cars. The light turned red, we stop. Turn green, and the person up front doing something in the car, and the light went from green to red, and not a horn blew. And the New Yorker in me did so to hit the horn. And the Spirit said, yes, you bring your bad behavior to Florida. And I just sat down and said, Lord have mercy, look how you can get shaped by your environment and don't even know. The New Yorker in you that is ready to blow the horn before the light, you're watching the other light and it's gone from to amber, and you're ready to blow for the man in front of you to move. The New Yorker in me was ready to hit the horn to blow, to get that person, stop wasting time and get going. And I sat right there at this, and nobody else didn't know what happened. Or inside of me, I know, I said, Lord, have mercy and take from me this impatience, this New York mentality that I've cultivated to ready to blow your horn. And listen, oh, Lord hear me, but the horn ain't working out for over a year and I ain't fixing it. Yeah, I'm a mechanic, I can fix it. I decided I'm going to let that horn remain out and learn patience and sit at the light. If the door move, sit there. Inside me, shaped by the New York mentality, was ready to blow the horn. Nobody in Florida blew the horn. That person sit down. I mean, granted, the honor wasting time. But one set of behavior, bad behavior, is not an excuse for another set of bad behavior. So look at that. Jesus was in Nazareth, and he did not allow it to influence his behavior at any point in time. So if you want to run from the city life that is quote unquote going to shape you by behavior, it is there that you develop character and you learn to resist the evil, overcome it, and be sanctified in it. We would like, anybody here wish that this was a perfect church?
I do.
Yeah, it was just a perfect church, but that's not really a build character, you know. The same problem started where? In heaven, the perfect environment. It was a covering cherub sitting in the presence of the glory of God that starts singing right there. And when the Lord bring it to the earth and started over brand new, fresh again, what happened? When Adam sinned, where was he? In the perfect environment. That's not an excuse for bad behavior in any form. Right? That's not to say that we have a license to behave bad or anything. It is simply to say, if you're going to run from a bad congregation in order to perfect character, you will never perfect character. Let the Lord tell you move. That's the first lesson Jesus demonstrated. Sit here until I bring you food. And this is the person that can say, become brave.
So if we sit in Laodicea, maybe I could have said the same thing to sit down too.
Would you have known the difference between sitting there and advancing the sanctification or sitting there and getting worse? Good. So the problem is, or the solution is, know where the Lord has placed you and listen to that voice. When the Lord says to you, stay, stay. When the Lord says to you, move, you do what? You move. Alright? That is a lesson we must learn, because if we don't learn it, we can be either ahead or behind God. God wants us to be in tune with Him, so that when He says go, we go. When He says stay, we stay. And the Lord said to Elisha, follow Elijah. Elijah said, tarry here. I go on. He said, as the Lord liveth, I will not leave you. And he went from Jordan to all 3 of the schools of the prophets. And he said, as the Lord liveth, I will not leave you. And when he said, I'm about to be taken from you, ask me what you want. I want a double portion of the Spirit that you have. You ask a hard thing, but if you see me when I go, you're going to get it. And he would not leave his master, because that is where the Lord placed him. And he said, if you go to Jordan, I go into Jordan. If you go into Bethel, I go into Bethel. Jericho. There was a school of prophets, and all those areas Samuel set it up. opened the Red Sea, the Jordan, and walked through and followed. And the Lord took him up, Elijah, and he saw him, the chariot of the Lord. And the mantle came back to him, which means the Lord had now transferred the prophetic office and ministry from Elijah to Elisha. And when he was gone, then he turned around and, well, let me see if the power was mine and true. Jordan, where is the God of Israel? Open up. I went through that. The Lord gave him the sign. You have now the responsibility as prophet. The work that was Elijah put off, you're going to take up. It was now his duty to stay where the Lord said him to stay and do what the Lord said him to do, because he had now taken on that responsibility. It's something we have to learn. It's difficult sometimes, but human nature will rise up. All right, back to Matthew. All right, so between David and the Babylonian captivity, with how many generations? So, back to Hosea. Joel. I know I mentioned Hosea for a reason, but just go back to Joel again. We can come back to Hosea. You're back at Joel? Yeah. Right, Joel follows Hosea. Just turn the page over to Hosea 13 for a second. And verses 9 to 11. O Israel, thou hast destroyed thyself. Who destroyed people? Themselves. Thou hast destroyed thyself, but in me is thine help. I will be thy king. Where is any other that may save thee in all thy cities? And thy judges, of whom thou saidest, give me a king and princes. Which of the judges did Israel say to give them a king? Samuel. Alright, they said, now the Lord was governing them by judges and running them according to divine order. They said to the Lord, give us a king that may be rule over us, and we may be like all the other nations that are around us. So the Lord is asking them now in Hosea, where is any other that may save thee in all thy cities, and thy judges of whom thou saidest, give me a king and princes. Verse 11, I gave thee a king in mine anger, and took him away where? In my wrath. Huh? Yes, you just got to understand, all you got to do is understand God's anger and God's wrath. And Isaiah 54, 7 and 8, the Lord says, for a little moment I have forsaken thee, and a little wrath I hid my face from thee. So they said to the Lord gave them a perfect order, the divine order, and they come and said to the Lord, we want a king to be like the other nations. Now God wanted them to be an example to the other nations and say, look, we want to become like you because yours is the best government on the planet. Your ways of running are fantastic. No, they rejected the beauty and said, we want the ugly. So the Lord said, okay, if you want a king, we can give you a king. And the first 4 kings, as we saw last week, were bad behaved. The best human being is not qualified to run God's work without the Spirit of God. Even when the Lord gave them the Spirit, they were still mismanaged and behaving badly. Because Saul was not converted, and God converted him. And he said, he changed from that to run David up and down the hills of Judea and Jerusalem all the way into Philistine. And right down to Rehoboam, who split it in 2. So they asked for a king. The Lord said, I gave thee a king in mine anger, and took him away in my wrath. God's anger is not our anger. Alright? He was sad that they were rejecting. Now, if you give a person an ideal something, and they reject it and pick something less than ideal, you fix a nice meal for your son, daughter, and he left and gone to McDonald's. How you feel? Especially if you're in the kitchen, you fix it too. Spend all the time preparing it, and you get up and left that and gone to eating burgers and fries. The Lord was not angry as we count anger, but he was hurt that they were rejecting because he knew what would be the end result of it. So I gave them a king in my anger and took him away how? In the wrath. When God gave them up then, the same system that they chose is what brought them into subjection and would destroy them. So they pick a king, and who came and conquered them? Babylon. the king of Babylon, came and conquered them, took them into captivity. So listen, saints, Laodicea has picked a structure and a form of government like the papacy. Listen to me. Consistency in the word of God says the papacy don't conquer it. Alright, but some names about it. The papacy is going to conquer it, it's going to come under papal domination. The same way how Israel rejected the divine order and God as their king and head, and Babylon came and kicked them. Nebuchadnezzar is called what? The king of kings. But that is wrongly applied. Who's the true king of kings? Christ. But he was the king of kings, earthly kings, and he conquered all of them. And you wanted to be like the other nations, right? Go. Gave them a king of my anger and took him away in my wrath. They ended up right in Babylonian captivity because they wanted to be like Babylon. The Lord had them outlined as Israel. He in Christ by the Spirit through the angels, through the prophets, whoever he chose to direct them. They rejected that to put in the human organization. And a human organization that was ruling the world came and took them right because they wanted to go there. Well, you go there into Babylonian captivity. Alright, back to Joel. So verse 6 and 7 of Joel. After the judgments of the third and the fourth generations, brought them in to Babylonian captivity. This teeth of this lion and the cheekbones of a young lion, that was Babylon that came and took them in captivity between David and the captivity. 14 generations. Pardon me. And King Saul, now, Saul was the first king of Israel, right? But Saul had nothing to do with the genealogy of Jesus. He did not come through him. So you're counting it within the context of the genealogy of Jesus, and he's counted as the, well, he's not the first king, but he's the first king there when you're dealing out when it comes to the genealogy of Jesus, and come right through that royal line. Saul would have been an imposter. Alright? He would have been an imposter. He was put in there because God gave them a king after their own thinking. God looked into their hearts and picked a man of kingly bearing and appearance, head and shoulders above everybody, but he did not have the right spirit. But when he picked David, he had a different spirit that he could work with. Even when he was wrong, he acknowledged that God was ever forgiven, uplift and restore him. So when you get to Joel 1, 6 and 7, the judgment for the generations, and it took them from David all the way to Babylonian captivity. And that period here is the judgment that would come upon them because they rejected God's ways and put a form of government in operation God did not intend for them to have. Anytime you replace the divine with the human, it is inevitable that it will collapse because only God has the righteousness to keep any system or any government in operation. Alright, let me entertain you now, but we can close in 5 minutes and then we open up. Yes, what's it? So you all have a way of forgetting.
The choice that Israel made in asking for a king, should God have given them that freedom of choice, should have felt hurt?
Joab has freedom of choice. You're his father. He grows up and chooses to be a drug dealer. Will you feel hurt?
That's his choice.
I didn't ask you that, I don't know that you answer if you can feel hurt. Yes, you will feel hurt as a parent because he knew the consequences and the end result of the choice that they were making. The moment they set this system in operation, God knew they were going to end up in Babylonian captivity. So it wasn't a matter of hurt because he's been set aside. It was hurt because of what they're going to bring upon themselves. And this system of rulership, when Moses died, the Lord said, go up, you're going to die here, you're going to be buried, and Caleb going to take over. No political wrangles, no fighting, no campaigning, and nobody being killed to succeed. It was a divine order, beautiful and peaceful. But by the time they set up a monarchy, the majority of the kings after Rehoboam came to the throne through the murder and the destruction of somebody else. And one, Athaliah, what was her name? Athaliah, killed a whole family. So that the only boy that escaped was the little Josiah. They had to hide him in the sanctuary when age 8, and she killed her whole family to prevent any of the royal family from getting the throne so she can keep the throne for herself. And that is how earthly Babylonian systems run. And God did not want that evil upon his people. He was trying his best to protect them from that, but they were bent on having their own way. And when they chose it, there wasn't anything else he could do, but he knew. And he felt the hurt in his heart because he saw how they would deteriorate and become like those other nations that succeed to the throne by killing your rivals and successors. And it's partly the reason why in the book of Daniel and his 3 friends were castrated. Alright? But if you don't have any posterity for the throne, you got less chance in the inclination to want to poison me on the throne. So the majority of eunuchs that were in the royal court were castrated. Take away any potential for posterity, so you don't have anybody inherit the throne. You have less inclination to want to poison the ruler. And you know, in those days, before the king drank anything, you had people before who would taste it, so if there's any poison, they can drop dead before the king. How can you live? Why would you want to be king when you don't even know who's going to take your life? In God's order, they did not have to worry about those things, and you didn't have that kind of system in operation. They were free, under God, and for him to see them choosing that form of government, yes, it was heartbreaking to him. Not because he was jealous, as we would say, or the Bible would say, but he was hurt to see his children making a choice that would bring them down to being worse than the other nations that he wanted them to look, the other nations to look at his government and say, listen, that is a fantastic form of government, let us adopt it. Get to know the Lord and experience his righteousness. Israel left the righteousness and went to the iniquity and chose to be like Babylon. Ended up then in death. So in Joel 1, you have the 4 generations and the 4 scourges, verses 3 and 4, and the judgment that fell upon them. So that second 14 generations between David and the Babylonian captivity are the ones that reap the harvest that was sown by them to say, according to the Lord in Hosea 13, give us a king to rule over us. God said, give him a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath, so that when Nebuchadnezzar came, his wrath was felt by the king, put out his eyes, and took him into Babylonian captivity, and he stayed there for 70 years. Should be cool enough, right? Alright, we will go to, now, the whole of Joel has a primary and a secondary application. And its primary application, just as introduction, I was already 7, is to the Jewish nation then. Its secondary application is to the Adventist world. And Joel, turn to chapter 2. Then we get down into the generations in detail and the watches. We will come back to this and we see God's effort to heal and restore. Joel 2, introduction and closing up with this. From verses 23. I don't want to intro. Anyhow, let me just introduce it to you. These verses now shows the restoration that the Lord was going to give to Jerusalem. Let me start at verse 18. Then will the Lord be jealous for his land and pity his people. Yea, the Lord will answer and say unto his people, behold, I will send you corn and wine and oil, and ye shall be satisfied therewith, and I will no more make you a reproach among the heathen. Remember when they came in Joel 6 and 7, everything was destroyed. Joel 1, all the corn, all the wine, all the vines, everything was bare and destroyed. The Lord is showing them now restoration, verse 20. But I will remove far off from you the northern army. Who's the northern army? Babylon. I will drive him into a land barren and desolate, and his face toward the east sea, and his hinder part toward the utmost sea. And his stink shall come up, and his ill savour shall come up, because he have done great things. Fear not, O land, be glad and rejoice, for the Lord will do great things. Be not afraid, ye beasts of the field, for the pastures of the wilderness do spring. For the tree beareth her fruit, and the fig tree and the vine do yield their strength. Be glad then, ye children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he hath given you the former rain moderately, And he will cause to come down for you the rain, the former rain, and the latter rain in the first month. Now, whenever you hear this phrase, former rain, latter rain, there are only two denominations that mention those. Jews, Adventists. Alright, these are the only two that really, when you come to Protestant, they talk about what? Pentecost. Same thing, but they use that word. So when you hear former rain and latter rain, it is either Jew or Adventist. So this is its primary application, is applying to the Jewish nation and their restoration from the Babylonian captivity, driving the northern army out. Verse 24, and the floor shall be full of wheat, and the vat shall overflow with wine and oil. Now, when you read verse 23, the margin tells you what? The margin of verse 23, when it says, former rain moderately, it says what? A teacher of righteousness what? According to righteousness. And that is the message that the Lord sent to the Adventist church beginning in 1888. The teacher of righteousness, the message of the Lord in his great mercy sent what? A most precious message to his people through Jones and Weigand. The message of Christ and his righteousness was sent to begin to restore Adventism. And just to give you an introduction, in 1888 would have been 4 years into the second generation of Adventism. So that the iniquity that was sown in the first generation, which is the Laodicean condition that was officially pronounced by 1859, when we get to that, I will show you the quotation from Testimonies to Ministers, Volume 1, 185 to 187. The Lord has shown me that the message to the Laodiceans applies to God's people at this time, that was 1859. And you have the second purest church. Ephesus was the purest. Philadelphia was the second purest. And I always says that in GC 4:1. Of all the Protestant, of all the churches, none were pure or freer from the words and impure than that of the summer of 1844. So Philadelphia, true Adventism, was second in purity to Ephesus, which was founded by Christ himself. Christ as the chief cornerstone, the apostles, and under the ministry of Gabriel and his fellow covering cherub. That church was pure, went forth conquering and to conquer. And it was the only one that was second to that is Philadelphia, was just behind that. And by 1859, Philadelphia went from being second purest to being one that made the Lord sick. I will spew you out of my mouth. In 15 short years, it went from being the second purest to being the worst. The Lord said, whether you cold or hot. And the iniquity that developed in the very early in the first generation, the Lord set about to heal it early in the second generation. If they have received this message of righteousness by faith, verse 25, and I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten, the cankerworm, and the caterpillar, and the palmer worm, my great army which I sent among you. The only solution to the healing of the Laodicean condition is accepting the message of righteousness by faith. If it is never accepted, Adventism will never be healed.
Like I said, the reason why it's not accepted because they don't recognize the condition. They're not willing to accept the condition first, and not to accept the message.
The message is to show you a condition. But they say they have accepted the message when they don't even know the message nor the condition. So the only solution, the Lord wants to restore us. Alright? He says, I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten, the cankerworm, and the caterpillar, and the palmer worm, my great army which I sent among you. How many of those? 4. So it's going to bring us down now. We've gone through the 4 generations of sowing and reaping. One complete cycle of sowing and reaping from 1844 to 2004. That ended that cycle of sowing and reaping. The iniquity was sowed in the first generation, the one condition, was not repented in the second. The Lord tried through G. White, Jones and Weigand and others to bring the message all the way up. They rejected until the prophet died, and the Lord knew it was out to sea. He had to wait for the next generation, and by the time the prophet died in 1915, by 1917 you had communism, and following on you had 2 world wars. Satan was intended to mash up the places, and don't let God get back any foothold on this planet to get his work back on track. And the Lord had to wait through that entire cycle of sowing and reaping to give himself another opportunity to be able to finish the work and cut it short of righteousness. This is where we are right now. This is why we're looking at these. So we need to know the time of our visitation and where we are, how we are to be studying, understanding, accepting, applying the message, and wrestling with the Lord for victory. Now, the same way how Cyrus said, God have given me a kingdom and commanded me to build a house at Jerusalem, I am going to do it. We must see it that way. God has given us a work to do, and we must be willing to do it. He can't force, but He gives us the light to show the opportunity where we are and the word He wants us to do for Him, and He will have a people that will respond. So we are here at this time now, coming through the 4 generations from 1844 to 2004 with the 4 generations, 4 40-year periods, bringing you to 160 years. We are now 170. By next month, we're going to be having a 70. We're going to be entering into the second watch, breaking down the generations into watches. We're going to be entering the second watch, and Christ says He can come in the second or the third watch. By the time we get to the watches, we will go into that in greater detail. So Joel shows us the 4 generations and the judgments that fell upon them because of their rejection, and God shows us the only solution to that is to receive the message of righteousness by faith, so that He can restore to us all that we would have lost during that cycle of sowing and reaping from 1844 to 2004 would have been that complete cycle of sowing and reaping. All right, questions? Brother Stephen.
In Isaiah 8, you were looking at the waters in Babel, and you were saying, you shall overflow and go over, you shall reach even to the neck and the okay, verse 7 says, now therefore behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, surely even the king will stare in all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels and over all his banks. Now I am wondering, does this entail that Babylon as a principle has so drenched the world that you know, because but the word Babylon now becomes synonymous with worldliness, so that it coming over all the channels and all the rivers reveals the fact that this is the foundation of the world. The principle of Babylon is what is seen, so that when you even come to the papacy at the end, the papacy is compared to Babylon, and you have Babylon the Revelation and Babylon the Great. That principle of trusting to self and you know, relying upon the power of man, that principle is revealed there, even in verse 8, affecting even Judah. So even that principle is even seen among the churches, and it is something that we realize that God has to recover the world and the church from.
Because whenever there are only two classes, right? You're either God's people or you belong to the devil, whatever the definition, Egypt, Babylon, however you want to call it. But in the context of Israel, it was taken into captivity by who? Babylon. And when the time would come, the Lord said, come out of her, my people. So taking the spiritual application, coming over now to our time, Babylon conquers the world. And so we are told to come out of it, because everything in this world is run according to the Babylonian principle. The earthly governments are Babylonian, and sadly the church is structured by that same principle, where you have one human being voted into that position by other human beings and running it according to worldly standards, and the divine order is absent completely in the end time. Now, the final church that will be translated, what is its name? Ain't no name, it's just numbered. So we are told to strive to be among the 144,000. So it means there will be the absence of that Babylonian structure where you have a man or a group of men being head of the church and telling you what to do. God wants each one of us to be under the control of His Spirit, and for Him to direct us individually, and thus He can direct us collectively. But that Babylonian system, we must come out of that too. Don't start voting, because I just start voting, you can end up right where voting start in Babylon. Alright? And the order of God is revealed, and He will have His people come back to that, so that I am not your head. Because when you leave here, I don't even know where you are, where you're going. I can't tell you what to do. If you have a connection with God, and I am in Brooklyn asleep, and you in Pennsylvania, can God direct you?
Yeah.
Of course, and He will direct His people. He wants us to have an individual connection with Him, but the church is so accustomed to the Babylonian order that it has difficulty seeing the divine, and God has a problem trying to get us back to the divine order. Sister Vivian.
Yes, you said something about King Saul being his husband. So the question is this: David was chosen by God and King Solomon. What about the offspring? They all got the crown. Would you consider them also imposters?
No, I said King Saul was an impostor within the context of
They
the
were chosen by the people.
the line, the genealogy.
But what about the other that was not chosen by God, even though it was a royal line?
Yes, I'm speaking within the context of the genealogy of Christ. Because Saul was not in that genealogy. David, Solomon, Rehoboam, all those kings, and he was in that genealogy following down the line. But King Saul was an impostor. He was not in the line of Judah. Saul came through, what's the tribe? Benjamin? The small tribe, Benjamin. So the Messiah had to come through the royal line, which is Judah. Right, and Saul was not of that. I just picked that within the context of him being outside of that line, the genealogy. Sister Roberts.
I was just making a comment based on what you were saying, that would be God's invisible church.
And it must be visible too. Because even though it is invisible, it will be visible because he's going to have a visible body of believers on this planet, and each one will be known by the Lord because Christ is his head and directing him. Brother Clement. You pass? Good to know that you got to pass him, Mark. The Lord wants all of us to pass and nobody to fail. Alright? Any other questions or comments? We will close. Remember that the 4 is the number of judgment, and the 4 generations are identified in Joel 2, Joel 1, 2 and 3. And we're going to get to generations of Adventism as we come along so we can identify and then come down to the watches and see and know where we are, so the Lord will have us enlightened so we can work with him, because he has to go with the order. These are principles that are outlined, and he himself is bound by it, because any particular generation that does not break off iniquity, God knows he's committed to waiting for another cycle of sowing and reaping and judgments falling.
I want to ask a question in the context of having a king and at the same time the role of the prophet. How does that operate in God's church today?
Having a king and the role of a prophet, God would only have the prophet. God did not want a king. When the people insisted on having a king, God reserved the right to choose the king. And the king was subject to the prophet under God. You know. So when David was king, when the Lord sent Nathan to David, I got a message for you. What is it? Here. And when the Lord was finished with him through Nathan, he had to accept the word of the Lord through Nathan, although he was king and above Nathan in the physical realm, and accept the word of the Lord. Every king that did not accept the word of the Lord through the prophet found himself in serious trouble. Ahab and many others showed. When Elijah came to Ahab, no invitation, walked right through without invitation or anything, and delivered the message and departed. If the king listened to the Lord through the prophet, although it's an apostate organization, it can still run successfully because he'll be taking orders from the true king. If the GC of Adventists, if the presidents were willing to listen to the prophet, the history of the Adventism would have been different. Alright? The history of Adventism would have been different. They knew she was the prophet of the Lord, and they knew what was coming from her was from the Lord, but when it was not in harmony with them, they rejected the prophet's ministry and put her on a boat and sent her all the way to Australia. The Lord said, no problem, you go ahead. And was able to show that her in Australia what they were doing in America. And that is why you don't have an earthly king, because he wants to run the work according to, I am king, my word is law. You prophet, well, I got more authority. No. In the work of God, the prophet has the highest authority. If they are willing to accept God's counsel, even though it's a corrupt system, the king is willing to listen to the prophet, the work can still be a success, but it is not God's ideal. And they did their best to fight against her, fight against the message, and that committed her and all of them to the grave. All of them to the grave, because they rejected the divine order. How can you know? Now, let me ask you again then. Which was first? Prophet or king? Prophet. And even in Adventism, Ellen G. White was prophet for years before they had a president. We put him as the king. Ben was the General Conference first head up. 1863. Ben was Ellen G. White called to the prophetic office? 1844. Way ahead. And if they were willing to listen to the prophet who was in position and authority before them, God would have been able to direct that movement in spite of the apostasy and bring them out of the apostasy, because part of the message of Righteousness by Faith was for Jones and Wagner to call them away from that Babylonian system back to the divine order. But normally when the king get power, he giving up civility. So God will have to give up the system and let it do like what happened to Israel. Let Nebuchadnezzar come and take you into Babylonian captivity and mash up the did they have a king after that? No. They didn't have no king after Babylonian captivity. Ellen G. White says after Babylonian captivity, they were effectively cured of idolatry and all that system. It was gone. Give them a king in anger, took away the wrath, and they had another king until Christ came. The only king on the throne then was who? Herod. And they said, they want a king so bad, they was willing to reject the king of glory and take one of the worst kings on the planet. We have no king but Caesar. You can want a king so bad that you can reject the Lord of glory and choose somebody like Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. That's no problem. Have Caesar. Start his work out and left them to what they were chosen. And Rome, that they chose as their leadership, came and surrounded them again and burned down that city and destroyed Jerusalem. Probably the same how Nebuchadnezzar came and burned down Jerusalem because they wanted to be like them. And the papacy gonna come. Burn down the GC. Don't tell them I said that.
They when I come and burn it, they will burn it themselves. They will burn it themselves.
I follow the formula outlined in the scriptures, and the Jews be like, Babylon came and took the capital. The pick Rome came and burned it down. Pick the papacy came and burned it down. Alright.
What is the sad thing that I notice here, that being in darkness is a sad thing of state. When they themselves now trying the very best to do away with the writing of the prophet. Right? They're trying to deny being a prophet. Yet when you're baptized, one of your Bible is, then you believe.
In the spirit of prophecy.
So that they confused about.
That's part of the Bible confusion. Brother Clement.
You made earlier statement that they rejected the book of the Levites or the book of the prophets, and as a result, both they and the prophet went into the wrong. Could you explain what the language is?
When the people of God reject the ways of God, God has to quote unquote change his plans. It was the purpose of God for Israel to go into the promised land, an 11-day journey turned into 40 years. Because the people abandoned God's ways, which was for them to follow the cloud, break camp, and he said break camp and enter in. They were not to send out any spies to go to see which way they should go. They were simply to be following God's way. He led them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, threw them up and through the Red Sea, baptized all of them to give them a fresh start and bring them up, and he was going to take them into the promised land the same way. They abandoned God's ways, implemented their own ways, and Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb, who were ready to go into the promised land, had to turn and walk and wander in the wilderness for another 40 years, in spite of the fact that they were ready to go in. The Ellen G. White could have gone in, but if God can't take you in without the rest of the church. So since they were not willing, she had to lay down and rest. So did those who would have gone. All right. Let us pray.